When you're dealing with action methods, one piece of the puzzle is obviously the name and the HTTP request for picking the right action. But just about every action method, unless all it's doing is returning static content, it's also going to need some inputs. It's going to need some data or objects that come in from the outside so that the action method actually knows how to do its job, whether it's just the ID of a particular object or it's an entire collection of form data. So that's what action method input is about. Unless we're just serving up static content, we are probably going to need to take in some input. And there are three main ways that an action method gets its input. One is from the context object, one is from parameters, and one is from the actual model bindings. The context object is something that's been in use since classic ASP, and those of you that come from a classic ASP background will recognize some of these context objects right off the bat. Whenever you make a request, there are pieces of information tied to that request. In classic ASP, you might remember dealing with, say, the request object or the server object or the response object. And these are really, if you think about them, collections of environmental variables that gave you information about the request. Well, as the .NET framework has evolved, other objects have also come into play. So we're not just limited to these guys anymore. There's a few other things. For instance, MVC also supplies route data as an object, so you can pull routing information from the URL. So whenever a request comes to the MVC framework, right off the bat, we can pull out of the route data what the action was, what the controller was, and use that information in various ways. Now, one caveat I want to put on this is that many context actions are not available outside of an actual HTTP request. In other words, you need an actual web request in order for these objects to be formed and have data in them, because that's what kind of drives this data. Well, normally this isn't a problem, but if you're doing unit testing, it is a big problem because you don't have an actual HTTP request. You're just running the code. So there's some different ways around this. For instance, what I like to do is just write a wrapper object around the HTTP context so that I can use that object in my unit tests as opposed to the actual HTTP context. But it is something to keep in mind that if your code depends on context objects, unless you fake that object in some way, when you run your unit test, the context object is probably not going to have any data in it because it needs the actual request in order to put data in. So let's take a look at how we might pull out context information and use it. What I'm looking at here is the default home controller that you get with the regular MVC project that Visual Studio has. And what I've done is I've added a method here that will override the handle unknown action. So if the home controller gets invoked, but the MVC framework can't find the appropriate action, this method's going to fire. And here's all the different things I could be doing with this. But for demonstration purposes, all I'm doing right now is just writing out this message. Okay, this action was called and we can't find it. Well, that's all very well and good, but let's actually use some context data to supply a little bit more information. Let's say that somebody puts in an unknown action, and what we really want to do is write out some detailed information about the request. So one of the things I might do is create a message here. Set that equal to string.format. And I'm not going to write out every possible piece of context information that we might use, but I do want to draw our attention to a few things. So for example, let's say I use the server. Maybe we've got our application distributed across a server farm, and it would be good to know which server actually got hit when this request came in. And let's say that I want to know the browser that was used. Maybe all this is going to go in a log file or, get sent to the help desk or something like that. Actually, let me adjust my numbers here a little bit. And let's go ahead and put in, say, the controller. Okay, so I'm going to get the server, I'm going to get the browser, and I'm going to get the controller. Let me put a line break in here. Okay, so here I'm going to request these from the context object. So I'm going to put in the server dot machine name. And I'm going to put in the request dot user agent. And I'm going to put in the route data values for controller. So all I'm doing, these aren't objects I have to instantiate or populate or anything. These are things that automatically get spun up by the framework. And I can pull information out of them to use them in meaningful ways. So here all I'm doing is I'm going to the server, saying what server am I on, what browser made this request, and what controller did it invoke. This is going to fire if I get an unknown action here. So I'm going to build this, start it up. I'm going to put in an action that controller won't recognize. And it's not writing anything because key to getting an actual message back is not just forming the message, but writing it out. But I had a really great message formed there. Not a lot of value to the user or somebody monitoring this application, though. So let's give this a go. There we go. So this tells me the server, tells me the browser, and tells me what controller was invoked. And there's all kinds of data that I could pull out of those objects if they would be helpful to me. Probably the most common way that action methods get their data or get information from the outside is through parameters. Just like any other methods, action methods can also take a parameter or even several parameters. Matching parameters are searched for in this order. First we look for form data, then route data values, then the query string. So if, for instance, I have an action method that takes 2 or 3 different parameters, the MVC framework is first going to look to see if it finds those in posted form data. If it can't find them there, then it's going to look in the actual route data values. Are they in the URL somewhere? And if it can't find them there, then it's going to see if they were attached to the end of the query string. The one exception to this is that by default, ID parameters are added to the end of the URL. So if you have URLs that go to actions that need a specific ID, you can just add that to the end of your URL as opposed to doing a query string or posting it or anything like that. That's such a common operation that actually gets built into the URLs of the MVC framework. Over in the home controller, where we have the default methods that come with it with the MVC internet template, I'm going to add a new action here. And instead of doing a view or that whole thing, I'm just going to return a string. And just to demonstrate how I can pull parameters out, I'm going to call this method something like, I don't know, use parameters. And I'm going to pass in a string ID, a string name, a string controller, and a string action. And I'm going to just output all of these parameters. Okay, so let's just say ID equals whatever the ID happens to be. Put a line break in there. The name equals whatever that parameter happens to be. The controller. And the action. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug in those parameters just so you know they're coming in. So what I should get when everything is working correctly is a string that just lists out our parameters for us and then displays those. And I'm actually going to, let's see, let me do it this way. And then I'm going to write out the message. Okay. So the controller is home, the action name is use parameters, and it's going to look for all 4 of these pieces of information. And that's how it's going to match up the parameters. So I'm going to fire this up. And at first, I'm going to call the action without supplying any additional information at all. So here's the controller, here's the action. Now, you'll notice that the ID is blank, you'll notice that the name is blank, but look what happened. We actually got a controller and action name. Because remember, one of the places that the framework is going to search for these parameter values is the context. And so the context already knows, the route data context already knows the controller name and the action name. So it can plug those parameters right in without me having to establish them or do anything else with them. So the action took those values, but it couldn't find an ID anywhere and it couldn't find a name anywhere. Okay, so let's say I do something like this. Now I'm showing an ID of 7 because remember, by default, the controllers and the routing patterns are always going to look for the ID at the end. Controller name, action name, ID. Okay, so now it knows the ID parameter. Well, what about name? Well, I'm not going to write up a whole form to post to this page, so let me just put the name in the query string. Okay, and now it's pulling that value for that parameter. So it's finding these from the context, from the route data. It's finding this from the ID parameter here at the end, and it's finding this from the query string. And we could just as easily write a form that had these as HTML form fields and post them to this page, and it could pull those values out of there as well. So that's another way that action methods can get their data. Another way that action methods can get data to them is through model bindings. In fact, I would say that this is probably the most common when you have good-sized object-oriented applications. You know, for a very, very small MVC application, you might not have too many model bindings, but the vast majority of MVC applications you put together is probably going to use model bindings to pass data around and fire correct actions. The model object is bound to the view by the controller. So that much we know. The controller gets the model, it gets the view, it smushes them together, and the view can display pieces of that model, return that dynamically to the user. But you can also submit that model back to the controller by way of a post action. So if you have a form and all the fields of that form match your model, you can submit that back to your controller action and it will actually put those together back into a model object. And these models can also be validated by the controller. So if you have extra rules like one property is required or has to be between 5 and 7 or any business rules around how the model is supposed to look, the controller can actually validate those and insert error messages if there's a problem. In order to illustrate what it's like to use a model binding to get data into an action, I created a model class myself. It's for dogs. We get an ID, we get a name, we get an age. I'm not saying it's comprehensive information about a dog, but it's enough to keep in mind. I guess I could have used person just as easily. I don't know. Maybe I've just got dogs on the brain this afternoon for some reason. And here's my controller to deal with this model. This is in my models folder. This is my controller that deals with dogs, and so I'm not really connecting to a database yet. All I did was I just made a private variable that's a list of dogs, and I put in 3 dogs, IDs 1, 2, 3, different names, different ages. This is kind of pretending to be a database, really, but it's just this static list. So when the index method fires up, it's going to pull up the index view and pass it the entire list of dogs. Well, if I look at the index view for dog, you'll notice that it is bound to an enumerable of dog. And what it's going to do is, for every item that's in there, it's going to display the dog's name, the dog's age, and it's going to create some links to edit and to look at the details and to delete and use the ID in all of those links. So when I actually fire this up, and here's my base URL, I'm going to use the dog controller and I'm going to use the index method. So what happens is when I use that URL is it goes to the dog controller because that's the URL that I used. It goes to the index method, and all it does is give me this view with this model bound to it. Okay, so the controller's just doing something very basic. So here's all the dogs that are in that list, and we're looking at all their information. Now, when I want to look at the details of only one dog, this is going to be a little different. Watch what happens when I click the details link. Notice how the URL changes. Okay, so I've still got the controller, I've got the details method, but now I've got an ID. So what happens over here in the action is this method gets called, details, it gets the ID from the URL, and what I do is I select the dog where the ID is the ID, and then I bind that to the view and I return that view. Okay, all fine and good. When I go to edit, it does something very similar. It puts in the ID of the dog I want to edit, but notice what happens. When I post an edit, this is what's firing right now. Edit with an ID, it's getting the view back. And actually what I should probably do is go ahead and find that dog and go ahead and put that dog in the view. So let's do that. Let me get out of debug mode here and go down to edit. So I'm getting the form that I want, but I want to go ahead and put the dog that I'm going to edit in there so I can pre-populate the boxes and that kind of stuff. Okay, so I'm back here. Dog index. I pick the dog I want to edit. I mean, Methuselah's age kind of looks like a typo to me, so let's go there. Okay, so here's the dog I want to edit. And, I can reduce his age to something more reasonable for dogs, like 10, for example. And the reason that you're not seeing the age reflected here is because this isn't a real database. This is a list that just gets recreated. But you'll notice that when I posted that, all it still had was the ID in the parameter. Okay? But what also got posted was this form collection. Okay, so when I filled out that form, each of those form fields got posted to this method. It's an HTTP post, and then I could put logic in here to go through that form collection and set the properties that I wanted to. Or, what would be even better is to do this. Because here's the cool thing about the MVC framework. Since I have a dog bound to that view, when I fill out those form fields and I hit submit, it's going to understand that those fields match up to a dog object. So when it fires this method, I'm going to get a populated dog object here. So what I can do is I can find this dog by the ID, and I can do something like dog.name equals dog.edit.name. Dog.age equals dog.edit age. And then, if this were a database, I'd want to save the dog, which sounds like a great campaign too. Okay. Now, since this is just a list, I could go through the trouble of manipulating the list, but you see what I'm doing here. Because when I called this, I bound a dog to the view. When it fills out that form and posts, it will actually post that here Okay. This dog will actually get passed into the method, and then I can refer to that object just like I would any other object. So it's like strongly typing my actions to the objects that they control. Now, the great thing about this is not only is it easy to work with, but it allows you to automatically work with, say, ORMs. Say, for example, you've got Entity Framework up and running. Well, all your data classes look like this anyway. So why not just have your actions take in a posted whatever it is, and then go ahead and deal with it? So if you look, for instance, in the default account controller, this is exactly what they do. So for example, here for login, they take in a login model. For registering, they take in a register model. They take that model in directly from the form and then use its properties in the logic to do whatever it is they're going to do.